In the name of God, the Beneficent, the Merciful, the Creator and the Sustainer of the universe, peace and blessings upon His servant and messenger Muhammad forever. Ameen. I greet you with the usual greeting on the program. It's a greeting that is commonly used by Muslims. It's a universal greeting used by all of the prophets from Abraham through to Prophet Muhammad. It's the greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be unto you. I'm your host, Hamid Rashid. Today we have our 35th program in our series dealing with the social system of Islam. We'll be having our fifth and concluding discussion on the topic of polygamy in Islamic law. I have joining me on the program as usual Dr. Jamal Badawi of St. Mary's University. Brother Jamal, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
I wonder if I could ask you just to quickly highlight the main points that we covered last week in our fourth program on this topic of polygamy in Islamic law.
Okay. We continued last time our discussion of some of the individual contingency or emergency situations which may make polygamy, or more accurately polygyny, a better solution for cases like that, such as barrenness, illness, and so on. We also talked about some of the guarantees and protections provided for women, in particular in the case of polygamy, whether she is a second wife, whereby she's not forced into that situation, she has a free choice, or if a first wife, we indicated the variety of measures which would protect her, such as asma or delegated repudiation, that is, she could have the right of unilateral divorce of her husband should he take a second wife, if that's specified in the contract, or she could include strict monogamy as a condition for the continuation of marital relationship, or she could go to the judge if she's hurt and she feels that her rights and vested interest has been affected by her husband taking a second wife. Or even if the judge doesn't agree, we said finally she can even apply the concept of khula, whereby she can make some agreement to return some of the payments that her husband made to her and be relieved from the marital relationship. And finally we were dealing with the question of why not polyandry? Why did not Islam allow the having plural husbands for the same wife? And we discussed that both from the biological, social, as well as instinctive and psychological aspects.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, we've commented thus far on some of the advantages of polygamy. What about the other side of the coin? Are there disadvantages?
Yes, for sure. Well, of course, the most obvious disadvantage that perhaps pops into one's mind is the question of jealousy. No matter, what kind of woman you're speaking about or her degree of faith and commitment to God, no woman, on the average, wishes that any other woman shares her husband, shares his love, affection, or resources. I mean, this is a natural human inclination. There are disadvantages also for man himself. It's quite a job to keep two wives, not only from the problem of finances, but also very tough insofar as the Islamic requirement is concerned, that is to keep absolute justice, whatever is humanly possible, between more than one wife, which is a very hard job. But obviously, as a result of this difficulties, particularly the question of jealousy, there would be a constant problem for men also. It's not just like somebody sitting there enjoying having so many wives. There's constant quarrels that are likely to arise between the wives, if there's more than one, making his life very difficult. But even if there is harmony between those wives, they could conspire against him. In other words, they could unite and be harmonious with each other, but conspiring against him to get whatever they can or want from him. This kind of struggle and difficulty could also be passed on to the children If the man has children from more than one wife, again, there is difficulty vying for power, vying for the favor of the father. These are all problems. In addition to this, while the spirit of Islamic law, which we described before, shows that polygamy should be used, not abused. It should be only used as a last resort in certain problems. It's not a general rule. Like any other thing which is permissible, any other concession, there is always a chance of abuse or misuse of this type of concessions. But the problem in the final analysis really boils down to the comparisons or weighing the harms, relative harms and benefits from resorting to this measure. Whenever the benefits are greater, then polygamy might be a more wholesome solution to some of these problems.
Well, I wonder if perhaps I could get you to just elaborate a little bit in a little bit more detail in terms of weighing the harms versus the benefits.
In case of polygamy?
Yes.
Well, you see, in the societies where polygamy has been totally outlawed, we find that the problems which resulted or which may be connected in some way or the other to prohibition of polygamy are relatively greater than any problem which may result from allowing or permitting polygamy. In accentuating circumstances as the ones that we discussed in previous programs, we find that the people who are affected by that, whether they were men or women, face a very difficult and very limited type of choices if polygamy is not permitted. They may suffer or may be subject to suffering for the rest of their life, the deprivation of the warmth of marital life and the satisfaction of their instinctive need in such a moral and wholesome manner, the instinctive need that both men and women have in terms of getting children and having a family. This may lead some women who do not have a chance otherwise to get married to look for jobs in order to support themselves, in some cases to support themselves and their children in case they are widowed or divorced women who cannot find a single husband, that is a husband who would be married to them alone in a monogamous relationship. Now, no matter how much a woman can get from her job by way of salary or status, it definitely does not compensate for this basic and strong urge, instinct for motherhood, to have children and to raise a family. But in the meantime, we find also that to close the door for a wholesome and moral solution to some of these problems, even through polygamy, if need be, opens the door for moral corruption in society, which ultimately lead to the destruction and disintegration of the family, or even more cases of divorce, where, sometimes a problem that, like we discussed before, could be resolved by having a second wife. If the door is closed to having a second wife in these circumstances, the only other alternative would be to divorce, which is again another problem. You go through the vicious circle again, the consequences of divorce insofar as they affect the woman, the man, and the children also as victims of that. So when we really look at the problem with an objective eye, keeping these strong emotions aside for the time being, and we try to evaluate the various alternatives or options available in view of the moral values, at least, that prohibits adultery and considers illicit sex relations as something which is condemnable, it should not be there. Moral values which consider sexual relationship without commitment repulsive, if not even more repulsive as it may sound to people to have a second wife. I mean, It's very strange that some people would consider illicit sex relations as repulsive, but pure and wholesome marital relationship, even within the context of polygamy, as repulsive. This is a very strange way of evaluating things. Now, the question boils down then to this very simple comparison. Would it be better for a person to have a second wife in case this is a necessary step to solve certain problem, contingency? who is married to him in the daylight, when the known to be his wife, with all the legal protection for herself and for her children, with the full right to inherit her husband in case of his death, or to have hypocritical monogamy, I could call that. That is by getting married officially and legally to one wife, but in the meantime having so many mistresses or other illicit relationship where there is no protection, there is no moral laws observed, and there is no commitment whatsoever, leaving aside the psychological tormentation that the person goes through by feeling that he's committing infidelity towards his wife, that he's hiding certain things, the doubt that might arise in the mind of the first wife in case the man has other illicit relationship, the big shock for the wife when she discovers that her husband has had a regular relationship with other women. But even in this case, we should remember what was mentioned in the very early portions of this program, that polygamy, as viewed by Islam, is not really the general rule, but rather something to deal with exceptional problems, to provide a solution which is both practical and moral at the same time. We have seen already some difficulties. We acknowledge that there are difficulties and drawbacks in polygamy, but the question again is, which is the least of the two evils, if you will?
Well, now, thus far we've had a very good discussion of what is involved in polygamy. I wonder if I could ask you to explain to what extent polygamy is common in the Muslim world today.
Unlike what some people feel that, as indicated earlier in these programs, that some people tend to unfairly and incorrectly associate polygamy with Islam, and we have seen lots of evidence against that. The same thing, people also tend to think that in Muslim countries, because Islam permits polygamy, that it's something that's rampant. Many times my non-Muslim friends ask me when we talk about the question of marriage, how many wives do you have? I said, my goodness, I have only one wife. I have absolutely felt at no time any need for considering a different thing, even though Islam permits it. I mean, it's just a kind of stereotype, like those false stereotypes and overgeneralizations. In fact, there have been several studies on that, and various scholars give different figures for that, depending on the country where they made their surveys. But in none of them did I see, at least in terms of contemporary situation, any figures which is more than a fraction of 1%. And even in this case, we find it more common even in certain social milieus or circumstances, like among peasants, for example, where children are a very important part of the family economic situation. So there's no evidence also that there is any increasing or alarming increment in the number of people who are taking more than one wife, even in Muslim countries where this is permitted. So there's no major problem really as such. I'm not saying there's no problem at all, but there is no major problem that is really alarming in that respect.
Well, now, what is your view of those people who suggest or call for the prohibition or the abolition of polygamy in Muslim countries?
There are some, even among Muslim scholars and educated people, who have taken that position, which quite frankly I consider to be a very superficial and apologetic type of position. Apologetic simply because they are not really acting, they are reacting to all of the unfair accusations made against Islam and Muslims, and the stereotypes that are quite common in references about Islam by non-Muslims in West. But one should not react in that way at all. In fact, if we look at it objectively, hopefully, it is not a very useful thing really to outright prohibit polygamy, even in Muslim countries. At least there are three basic reasons for that. One is a basic methodological question. That is to say, from a Muslim standpoint, no human authority should supersede divine authority. And if Allah, or God capital G, did allow or give that concession for polygamy, both to the Old Testament prophets, as we have seen before, and in the case of the Quran, that is in the teaching of Islam, it is permissible. If God has permitted that, definitely for good reason, for some wisdom that He knew that some situations could be solved best through polygamy rather than divorce or adultery, then who are we as humans simply responding to attacks or being apologetic? Who are we to put our human wisdom above that of our Creator? So this is one. A second reason why this could not be a very good solution is that we have indicated before that the present state of polygamy in the Muslim world is so minute. When you talk about a fraction of 1%, you're not really talking about any alarming problem at all or major danger that absolute and outright prohibition may be helpful. A third reason why I do not agree with this kind of claim is that the approach of saying outright prohibition of polygamy is a negative approach. It simply says don't do this, but it doesn't really succeed to provide alternatives. What are the solutions to the problems that we discussed, for example, over the last one or two programs? How do you deal with practical, real-life situations like this which could happen in any place or any society? How do you resolve it? So it simply says don't do it simply because people feel it's repulsive, but it doesn't give any better, wholesome and practical solution to the problem. There is one case that I'm familiar with, at least in one Muslim country, where the legal system was modified to actually outright prohibit polygamy. But this country is ruled by a ruler who's quite westernized, not very committed, as far as I know, to Islam and the implementation of the law of Islam. So you just, follow whatever comes from the West, whether it's right or wrong, which is not a good and creative approach at all. And that resulted in some funny situations. For example, if you go to the judge and acknowledge that that second woman you had contact with is your legitimate wife, that you're married to her and that you're responsible for her legally, and if she has any children, you're responsible for them, then you will be punished legally and you'll be sent to jail. If you go before the judge and say, no, that second woman is not my wife, she's my mistress, you may go free. Which is, from a Muslim standpoint, is sheer hypocrisy. See? I mean, to commit adultery, or if you claim that it was only an adulterous or illicit relationship, you go free. But if you claim that I am responsible, it is commitment, it's a second legal wife, you go to jail. So this is, again, an indication of the superficiality of this kind of prohibition without giving a better alternative. I don't think there might be a better alternative in cases like this at all. So, in other words, to have an outright prohibition create problems rather than really solve problems.
Well, to continue the argument, some might say, well, okay, perhaps it's not wise to outrightly prohibit polygamy, but what about the restrictions of the imposition of some restrictions on polygamy in order to minimize some of the problems that are associated with it? How would you respond to something
like abuses, for example, or something?
Yes, that's right, yeah.
Well, you see, the question of trying to limit or stop abuses is a principle which is not inconsistent with Islamic law. Islamic law provides actually for that. But the main question, just like you indicated in the question, should not be by outright prohibition, by trying to take some other measures. However, if restriction rather than prohibition is the course of action that may be taken, it should also be done within the limits of Islamic law. It has been indicated before that there are two major conditions for the use of this concession of polygamy. And one is the ability, financial ability, to look after more than one wife, more than one household in many cases. And secondly is the observance of justice and equality between the wives, if there is more than one. And we have indicated again before that these are very difficult conditions, very tough conditions to meet. So if there is any legislation that ascertain and make sure or ensures that these conditions are met, it is not against Islamic law at all. But the main thing that one has to be careful about is that those conditions or restrictions should not be such that they turn out to be de facto prohibition. In other words, you can make so many restrictions to the point that it makes it almost impossible for people to solve their problems if there's a problem like that through polygamy. And as such, you might be pushing them to break the moral laws or moral code in Islam. There have been such kind of claims, and you go back even to 19th century, as early as the 19th century and early 20th century, we find that there have been some Muslim jurists even who called on some measures to prevent abuses of polygamy. Among those, the famous jurist Sheikh Muhammad Abdu, who, as reported by his student Muhammad Rashid Rida in his Al-Manar, which is like an interpretation or commentary on the Quran, where he quotes his teacher, indicated that Muhammad Abdu, as a Muslim jurist, felt that at his time there have been so many abuses of polygamy, and he actually was making some hint, without explicitly saying, that it is not against Islamic law that certain laws or regulations be passed to prevent those abuses. There have been several attempts after Sheikh Muhammad Abdu to make some kind of reform in the law, but unfortunately some of them amounted really to what might be called a veto right, that is to require an advance permission from the judge before the marriage can be, second marriage could be upheld, legal. But that again, like I say, places too much power in the hands of the judge in matter which is very intimate and very close to the private life of individuals involved. However, a better proposal was made by another great jurist, famous one also, Sheikh Muhammad Abu Zahra. And in his book, Lectures in Marriage and Dissolution of Marriage, that's in Arabic, I just gave the translation, he said that we have to make a distinction between religious condition and legal conditions. There are some religious conditions which are based on the ethical convictions of the individual and his religiosity, if you will. Not all of these conditions should be turned into a legal condition which requires a certain judge to sign and approve of. And he said that the question on the sensitivity of marriage itself should not make the permission of a judge as an absolute precondition for the validity of a second marriage. The same idea seemed to have been implemented in Syria, for example, in the personal law passed in 1953 in Syria. It said that the judge may refuse to give a permission to the person to have a second marriage, but if the person gets married without the approval of the judge, the contract, marital contract, is legal, it's acceptable, but the person may be, for example, fined for not registering marriage in the proper way. But it does not say you can never get married because the judge thinks that you should not. So this is some of the these are some of the measures which could be legitimately taken without necessarily using the outright prohibition as a solution. Reasonable restrictions like that would be within the boundaries of Islamic law.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've been discussing prohibitions and restrictions and so on in the Muslim context. What about the situation of non-Muslim societies? Do you think that new legislation permitting polygamy may be relevant and useful?
I know even your question might be shocking to some who have been brought up to believe that polygamy is such a terrible thing that it exceeds in its repulsiveness any other thing, whether it's adultery or social ills or problems. But if we look at it more honestly, we can say that yes, it could contribute a great deal in resolving at least some of the problems, even in non-Muslim or Western societies. One reason is that the basic human nature, the fundamental human nature, is basically the same, regardless of people and their cultures or backgrounds or ancestors or whatever. There are certain basic things which are quite universal among all people. And some of the problems we discussed last time, like the incidence of prolonged diseases of a wife, of a youthful husband, the various problems pertaining to barrenness, and all of these are quite universal and not restricted to one society or the other. They're common. In addition to that, the fundamental or common social problems pertaining to male-female relationship is something which may vary in its form or format from one society to the other, but not really fundamentally. So whether you're talking about the East, West, or South or North, that doesn't make much difference really, because these are basic social problems which arises inevitably in any society. And polygamy could be a solution to those problems. The other thing is that one should keep in mind also that the West, like the East or any other place, is not really problem-free. And if your question really as to whether polygamy could be a solution or could be of some help if it's legalized in North America, for example, my answer definitely would be yes, because if you look at the social malaise of our time, the problems with sexual morality, the problems with disintegration of the family, problems of juvenile delinquency, the problem of divorce ratios, which goes sometimes as much as 40%, much more or many folds what you may find in societies like Muslim societies where polygamy is legalized. Well, if one look at all of these social malaise, I'm not saying that polygamy alone would solve the problem. There might be so many causes for these diseases or difficulties. But for sure, at least in some of those cases, polygamy, if legalized, could provide a more wholesome and more practical solution that would avoid breaking up of certain marriages and, again, decrease the extent of sexual immorality that could be quite rampant when all doors are closed to legitimate...
Well, I'm sure it may sound surprising to some of the people that are watching the program that indeed some Western scholars have called for the legalization of polygamy rather than condemning it as is commonly done. In the few seconds that we have left on today's program, could I ask you just to give us maybe an example of this view?
Well, there have been so many writers. For example, Anis Besant says that there is pretended monogamy in the West, but there is real polygamy without responsibility. And she goes on explaining again that it's just a kind of pretense rather than real monogamy that exists in the West. For example, Ram Landau says that polygamy must be considered both natural and legitimate. He also indicates that in most cases I have found that polygamous behavior or polygamous longing went hand in hand with the essentiality of monogamous nature. Another scholar, Professor van Ehrenfeld, he says polygamic marriage order has become necessary order that it will succeed monogamous system. He goes even as far as saying that it may succeed monogamous system because he says it is morally superior. Just to give one more, Professor Havelock Ellis, he says in no part of the world is polygamy so prevalent as in Christendom. In no part of the world is it so easy for man to escape the obligation incurred by polygamy. There are so many others. I'm not giving any exhaustive list. I wish we had more time to go through some of them, but I'd just like to conclude by saying that this is only a sample of many objective Western scholars who thought that perhaps in polygamy there is a more wholesome and practical solution for many problems. I'm not quoting this to say that divine commands or divine concessions need any human rationalization or justification. It simply shows that people, even aside from their religious convictions, can see in polygamy a solution. But let's remember what was repeated throughout these sections, this segment of the program, that after all, Islam views polygamy not really as the basic rule or general rule, but as something to meet a contingency situation, a very difficult problem that otherwise have no solution, in a more wholesome and practical way.
Fine. We want to leave it at that for today. We want to invite you back next week for our program, and we'll be talking about marital relations. Thank you for watching. Assalamu alaikum.
قلنا